Chapter 1. The Man in My Chair. Wade Reeves had built his life with discipline, routine, and hard work. At 46, he ran a commercial cleaning company that serviced office complexes, medical buildings, and several large retail chains across the county. It hadn't come from luck or family money. It had come from long nights, sore muscles, and years of showing up before sunrise while other people were still asleep. He still remembered the first job he ever landed, cleaning a small insurance office after hours. Back then, he drove a rusted white van that coughed every time he started the engine. The back of it smelled permanently of bleach and rubber gloves. Wade had done everything himself, scrubbing floors, emptying trash cans, polishing glass doors until his shoulders burned. Over time, the work grew. One client became 3. 3 became 10. Eventually, he hired his first employee, then another. Years later, the business had several crews, a small office staff, and contracts that stretched across multiple districts. But even with the success, Wade never lost the habits that built it. He still woke up at 5 every morning, still checked job reports himself, still visited work sites without warning just to make sure everything met his standards. Routine kept his life steady. His home life had followed that same pattern for years. He and Carla had been married long enough that their evenings had settled into predictable rhythms. Wade would usually get home around 6 or a little after, kick off his boots near the door, and Carla would be somewhere in the living room with a glass of wine and the television humming quietly. Dinner would follow. A little conversation. Maybe a show before bed. Nothing dramatic. And Wade had always been perfectly fine with that. Predictability meant stability. That particular evening had started like any other workday. Wade had driven across town for a meeting with a new property manager who was considering switching cleaning contractors. It had been a routine pitch, walkthrough of the building, discussion of service schedules, cost estimates. But the meeting ended quicker than Wade expected. The manager needed a few days to think about the proposal, which meant Wade suddenly found himself with an open hour in his schedule. So instead of returning to the office, he decided to head home early. The drive through the neighborhood felt quiet and ordinary. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawns. A few kids were riding bikes on the sidewalk. Someone down the street was mowing their yard. Everything looked normal. Wade pulled into his driveway, shut off the truck, and sat there for a second listening to the engine tick as it cooled. It felt strange getting home before his usual time, but not unpleasant. Maybe he and Carlo would order takeout tonight, he thought. He hadn't had Chinese food in weeks. He grabbed his keys and walked up the front steps. The moment he opened the front door, something felt off. It wasn't a loud noise or anything obvious, just a subtle shift in the air of the house. Wade stepped inside slowly, closing the door behind him. The faint smell of whiskey drifted through the living room. That was unusual. Carla preferred wine. She almost never drank whiskey. He walked further into the house, and then he saw him. There was a man sitting in Wade's chair. It wasn't just any chair. It was Wade's old leather recliner, the one he'd bought years ago after landing his first major contract. It sat in the corner of the living room, near the window, perfectly positioned for watching television. The stranger leaned back comfortably like he belonged there. One arm rested casually along the side of the chair. His posture was relaxed, almost lazy. A glass of whiskey sat on the side table next to him, half empty. For a moment, Wade just stood there in the doorway, his brain trying to process what he was seeing. Across from the man, Carla sat on the couch. She held a wine glass loosely in her hand. Her legs were crossed, and she looked completely at ease. Neither of them looked surprised to see Wade. That was the part that struck him hardest. No panic, no scrambling to stand up, no guilty expressions, just calm acknowledgement. The stranger finally set his glass down and rose slowly from the recliner. He was tall, maybe a couple inches taller than Wade, and dressed in expensive-looking clothes. A tailored jacket, polished shoes, the kind of outfit that suggested a man used to boardrooms instead of manual work. He stepped forward with the easy confidence of someone used to being in control of every room he entered. "Ah," the man said casually. "You must be Wade." His voice carried the relaxed tone of someone greeting an acquaintance at a cocktail party, not someone who had just been caught sitting in another man's chair. Wade didn't respond right away. His eyes moved slowly from the stranger to Carla, and back again. Carla lifted her wine glass slightly. "Wait," she said. "You're home early." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even nervous. Just an observation. The stranger extended a hand. "Grant Hollister," he said smoothly. "Nice to finally meet you." Wade looked at the offered hand, but didn't take it. Grant didn't seem offended. If anything, the corner of his mouth curled upward in a faint, amused smile. For a few seconds the room remained silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Wade finally spoke. His voice came out calm, controlled. "Why are you in my house?" Grant glanced briefly toward Carla before answering. "Well," he said lightly, "Carla and I were just having a conversation." The arrogance in the statement was almost impressive. Wade took another step into the room. "You need to leave." Grant tilted his head slightly, studying Wade like he was evaluating a business proposal. Then he gave a small, knowing smirk. For a moment, it looked like he might argue. Instead, he simply picked up his glass, finished the last sip of whiskey, and placed the empty tumbler back on the table. "Fair enough," he said. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair. As he walked past Wade toward the door, he paused briefly. Their eyes met. Grant's expression carried that same quiet smirk, the kind that suggested he believed he understood the situation better than Wade did. Then he opened the front door and stepped outside. A second later, the door closed behind him. The house fell silent. Wade remained standing in the middle of the living room. Carla took another sip of wine and set her glass down on the coffee table. "Wade," she began, "it's not what you think." He held up a hand. She stopped talking. Wade looked at the empty whiskey glass on the table, then at the chair, then at Carla. She started again. "I can explain." Her voice carried a rehearsed calmness that felt strangely detached. But Wade already understood enough. Something serious had been happening in his own home. But Wade didn't yell. He didn't explode. Instead, he quietly began thinking. Chapter 2, The First Suspicion. That night, Wade lay awake replaying the moment over and over. Sleep never came. The bedroom was dark except for the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. The red numbers shifted slowly forward, minute by minute, but Wade hadn't moved in hours. His eyes stared at the ceiling while his mind ran through the same images again and again. Grant's attitude, Carla's calmness, the casual way the man sat in his chair. It wasn't just the presence of another man in his house that bothered Wade. It was the way the entire scene had unfolded. Nothing about it felt sudden. Nothing about it felt accidental. It had felt normal to them. That was the part that kept echoing in his head. After Grant had left the house earlier that evening, Carla had tried to talk. At first, she had followed him into the kitchen. "Wade, you're misunderstanding the situation," she had said, leaning against the counter like she was explaining a simple misunderstanding. Wade had opened the refrigerator, pulled out a bottle of water, and twisted the cap slowly. "Am I?" he asked without looking at her. Carla sighed softly, like someone dealing with an inconvenient complication. "Grant is just someone I know through a friend. We were talking about a business opportunity." Wade took a long drink of water before answering. "In my chair." Carla hesitated. "Well, we just sat down for a drink." Wade placed the bottle on the counter. "You invited him here." It wasn't a question. Carla crossed her arms. "You're making this into something it isn't." That had been the moment Wade stopped engaging. He knew excuses when he heard them. Years of running a company had taught him how to recognize when someone was trying to talk around the truth. And Carla wasn't even trying very hard. After that, Wade had simply said he needed some air and stepped outside onto the porch. The sun had already set by then. The neighborhood streetlights cast pale circles across the pavement, while crickets hummed somewhere in the distance. He sat in one of the wooden chairs on the porch and stared out at the quiet street. Inside the house, he could hear Carla moving around occasionally, glasses clinking, footsteps crossing the floor, but she never came outside to join him. Wade stayed there for nearly an hour, thinking, observing his own reaction. He expected anger. Any husband walking into that situation would feel it. But instead, what Wade felt most strongly was something colder. Analysis. He had built his entire business by solving problems step by step. When a contract fell apart, he examined the numbers. When an employee lied, he reviewed the records. Emotion never solved anything. Facts did. Eventually, he went back inside. Carla was sitting on the couch again, scrolling through her phone. She looked up as he walked in. "Are we going to talk about this?" she asked. Wade paused near the hallway. "There's nothing to talk about tonight." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "So you're just going to ignore it?" "For now," Wade said calmly. Then he walked down the hall and went to bed. Now, hours later, he was still lying there staring at the ceiling. Next to him, Carla slept quietly. Her breathing was steady and relaxed. That bothered him too. Wade turned his head slightly and looked at her in the dim light. If she felt guilty, she didn't show it. If she felt worried, it didn't reach her sleep. His eyes moved back to the ceiling. The scene replayed again. Grant sitting comfortably in the recliner. The glass of whiskey already poured. Carla sitting across from him like it was a normal evening. No surprise when Wade walked in. No scrambling to explain. Just calm acceptance. Wade had spent years reading people. Clients. Employees. Contractors. Body language always revealed the truth long before words did. And the body language he saw tonight told a clear story. This wasn't the first time Grant Hollister had been inside that house. Wade slowly exhaled through his nose. It wasn't the behavior of someone who had just started an affair. It felt practiced, familiar. The next morning, Wade woke before sunrise, just like he always did. The house was still quiet. Carla was still asleep when he got out of bed. He showered, dressed for work, and walked into the kitchen to start the coffee maker. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room as the machine began to brew. Wade leaned against the counter and watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the pot. His mind was calm now, clear, the kind of focus he felt before making an important business decision. He poured himself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table. For several minutes, he simply drank his coffee in silence. Then he pulled out his phone. There was one person he trusted for situations like this. His older brother, Dennis Reeves. Dennis had spent nearly 20 years working investigations for the sheriff's department before retiring early a few years ago. Even now, he still had the instincts of a man who spent decades uncovering things people try to hide. If anyone could help Wade figure out the truth quietly, it was Dennis. Wade scrolled through his contacts and tapped his brother's number. The phone rang twice before Dennis answered. "Morning," Dennis said, his voice rough with sleep. "You awake?" Wade asked. "Well, I am now," Dennis replied with a faint chuckle. "Everything all right?" Wade looked down at the kitchen table for a moment. "No," he said calmly. "Not really." Dennis didn't interrupt. "Something happened last night," Wade continued. "I came home early and found a man sitting in my chair." There was a brief pause on the line. "What kind of man?" Dennis asked. "Confident," Wade said. "Too confident." Wade then described the entire scene. Grant sitting in the recliner. The whiskey glass. Carla's calm behavior. Grant introducing himself like it was a polite social meeting. Dennis listened without interrupting. Wade could almost picture his brother sitting quietly with a cup of coffee, absorbing every detail. When Wade finished speaking, several seconds passed in silence. Finally, Dennis spoke. "All right," he said slowly. "Let me ask you something." "Go ahead." Dennis's voice was calm and direct. "How long do you think this has been going on?" Wade didn't know, but he intended to find out. Dennis agreed to help quietly. If something was happening, they would uncover the truth carefully and legally. Chapter 3, Following the Evidence. Dennis began with simple investigative steps. He had always believed the truth revealed itself when people stopped looking for dramatic answers and started examining ordinary details. 2 days after Wade's early morning phone call, Dennis drove over to Wade's office building on the edge of town. The cleaning company operated out of a modest brick structure with a small parking lot filled with service vans marked with Wade's company logo. Dennis parked his pickup and stepped inside. The office smelled faintly of floor cleaner and fresh coffee. A receptionist sat behind the front desk answering calls while 2 supervisors discussed job schedules near a whiteboard filled with assignments. Wade was waiting in his small office at the back. When Dennis walked in, Wade pushed a stack of papers across the desk. "Figured you'd want to start with these," Wade said. Dennis pulled out a chair and sat down, adjusting his reading glasses. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Credit card statements," Wade replied. "Last 18 months. Dennis nodded slowly. "Good place to start." For the next hour, The two brothers sat in silence, flipping through documents. Dennis had brought a yellow legal pad and began jotting down notes whenever something caught his attention. Every now and then he asked a question. "Did you two travel to Cedar Grove last March?" Wade shook his head. "No." Dennis made a note. "What about Greenville in July?" "No." Dennis circled something on the page. At first the records looked ordinary enough. Grocery stores, gas stations, hardware supply purchases for Wade's business, regular bills, and household expenses. But the longer Dennis looked, the more certain transactions began standing out. Hotel charges. Not just one or two, several. Dennis slid one of the statements toward Wade and tapped a line with his pen. Riverside Suites. 2 nights. Wade leaned forward. "I didn't stay there." Dennis flipped another page. Same hotel again 2 months later. Another page. Different hotel. Same city. Wade frowned. "That's about 90 miles from here." Dennis nodded. "Exactly." They continued scanning the statements. Patterns began appearing quickly. Carla had unexplained trips to nearby cities. There were recurring hotel charges that didn't match family travel. Wade rubbed his jaw slowly as he studied the dates. "These weekends," he said quietly. "A lot of these are weekends." Dennis glanced up. "Where were you?" "Work," Wade replied. "Overnight jobs sometimes. Large office cleanings. I'd be at buildings until 2 or 3 in the morning." Dennis leaned back in his chair. "So she knew you'd be busy." "Looks like it." They worked through the credit card records until the stack of papers was gone. Dennis closed the folder and folded his arms. "Okay," he said. "Now we look at phone records." Wade opened a desk drawer and handed him another set of documents. Dennis scanned the pages carefully. Phone numbers repeated frequently throughout the months. Most were familiar: friends, family members, local stores. But a few numbers appeared far more often than the others. Dennis circled one with his pen. "Do you recognize this number?" Wade leaned closer. "No." Dennis circled another one. "And this one?" Wade shook his head again. Dennis wrote both numbers on his legal pad. "I'll run them later," he said. They spent another hour reviewing the call logs. Dennis counted dozens of short calls and text exchanges between Carla's phone and the same 2 unknown numbers. Eventually, Dennis closed the file. "All right," he said. "Next step." Wade crossed his arms. "What's that?" "Hotel reservations." Wade frowned slightly. "Reservations?" Dennis nodded. "Credit card charges tell us money was spent, but reservations tell us who booked the room." Later that afternoon, Dennis made a few quiet calls to contacts he still had from his years working investigations. Hotel managers and front desk supervisors often kept records longer than people realized. By evening, Dennis returned to Wade's office with a small notepad filled with fresh notes. Wade looked up as his brother walked in. "Find something?" Dennis sat down. "Yeah," he said. "I did." He flipped open the notebook and slid it across the desk. "These are the hotels matching your credit card charges." Wade scanned the list. Riverside Suites, Greenview Lodge, Harbor Point Hotel. All confirmed reservations, Dennis continued. Wade looked up. "Under Carla's name?" Dennis shook his head slowly. "No." Wade's eyes narrowed. "Then whose?" Dennis tapped the first entry on the list. Then the second. Then the third. Same name on almost every reservation. Wade leaned closer to read it. "Curtis Payne." Wade looked up. "Who's that?" Dennis shrugged slightly. At first it seemed unrelated. He leaned back in his chair. "But I did a little digging." Dennis reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. He slid it across the desk. Wade unfolded it. The page showed a company staff directory printed from a corporate website. Halfway down the page was a name Wade recognized immediately. Grant Hollister, Executive Vice President. Below that were department managers and support staff. One of them was listed as Curtis Payne, Administrative Coordinator. Wade stared at the page for several seconds. Dennis spoke quietly. "Curtis Payne works for Grant Hollister's company." The room grew silent. Wade leaned back slowly in his chair. "So the rooms were booked under his name?" he said. Dennis nodded. "But the timing always matched Carla's travel dates." Wade looked back at the list of reservations. City after city, hotel after hotel, dates stretching back month after month. Dennis tapped the notebook again. Same pattern every time. Curtis Payne books the room. Carla shows up the same weekend. Wade exhaled slowly through his nose, meaning Grant didn't want his own name on the reservation. Exactly. Dennis closed the notebook. Your friend Grant Hollister is careful. Wade sat quietly, staring at the papers scattered across his desk. Careful, organized, methodical. The same qualities Wade himself had used to build his business. Only Grant had used them for something else entirely. Dennis finally spoke again. Put simply, he said, Grant had been using his subordinate's name to hide the affair. Wade didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the dates. Trips he had never questioned. Weekends he assumed Carla spent visiting friends or running errands. Every one of them now looked different. Dennis folded his arms. This wasn't something new, he said. Wade nodded slowly. The evidence was clear. The relationship wasn't casual. It had been happening for over a year, and it had been carefully hidden. Chapter 4. The Financial Picture. Wade began examining his finances more closely. For most people, reviewing months of financial records would feel tedious. For Wade, it was simply another form of problem solving. Numbers had always told stories if someone took the time to read them properly. 3 evenings after Dennis uncovered the hotel reservations, Wade sat alone at the dining room table with a laptop, a stack of printed bank statements, and a yellow notepad. The house was quiet. Carla was in the living room watching television. The soft murmur of a reality show drifting faintly down the hallway. Neither of them had spoken much since the night Wade came home early. They moved around each other politely, almost like strangers sharing the same space. Wade preferred it that way for now. Arguments created noise, and noise made it harder to think. He clicked through the online banking records and began cross-referencing every suspicious transaction Dennis had flagged. Restaurant charges, boutique stores, gas purchases in cities Carla supposedly visited to see friends. Each line item looked harmless on its own. But when Wade lined up the dates beside the hotel reservations Dennis had discovered, the pattern became obvious. Dinner before the hotel. Breakfast the next morning. Shopping trips in the same city. He wrote numbers down carefully. $38 here. $120 there. $200 for a restaurant bill. By the time he finished adding everything, Wade leaned back in his chair and studied the total written at the bottom of the page. $8,947. Nearly $9,000. All of it coming from their joint checking account. Wade tapped the pen slowly against the table. $9,000 might not ruin him financially, but the number still carried weight. That money had been meant for household expenses, savings, and family plans. Instead, it had funded something else entirely. He closed the laptop for a moment and stared across the quiet dining room. Carla laughed softly at something on television. The sound echoed strangely through the house. Wade stood up and walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. As he passed the living room doorway, Carla glanced up from the couch. "You're still working?" she asked casually. "Just looking at some paperwork," Wade replied. She nodded and returned her attention to the television. The exchange lasted less than 10 seconds. But Wade noticed something. She didn't ask what kind of paperwork. She didn't ask why he was reviewing financial records at 9 o'clock at night. Either she didn't care, or she didn't want to know. Wade returned to the dining table and sat down again. He reopened the laptop and began reviewing another set of documents. Property records. The house itself had been purchased years before he married Carla. Back then, Wade had just started seeing success with his business, and his father had helped him navigate the purchase. Wade still remembered the conversation they had at the time. They had been standing inside the empty living room while contractors finished installing new flooring. His father leaned against the wall, studying the paperwork Wade held. "You planning to get married someday?" his father asked. "Maybe," Wade replied with a shrug. His father nodded thoughtfully. "Then make sure this house stays in your name." Wade had laughed at the time. "You think I'm going to lose my house?" His father's expression remained serious. "People change when money gets involved," he said. "Protect what you build." At the time, Wade thought the warning sounded overly cautious, but he followed the advice anyway. The property deed had been registered solely under his name. Now, years later, Wade opened the digital copy of that deed and read it carefully. Owner, Wade Reeves. No additional names. No joint ownership. He leaned back slowly. That meant legally Carla had no ownership claim to the house. A small sense of relief settled in his chest. At least one major asset remained secure. Next, Wade opened a folder containing documents related to his cleaning company. The business had existed for nearly 8 years before he married Carla. Every major contract, every piece of equipment, every employee hire happened before the wedding. The company had grown afterward, of course, but its foundation clearly predated the marriage. That detail mattered legally. If things eventually moved toward divorce, and Wade suspected they might, Carla's claim to the company would be extremely limited. He wrote another note on the pad. House, sole ownership. Business, premarital asset. Carla's legal leverage was weaker than she likely realized. Wade closed the laptop again. For a moment, he simply sat there listening to the quiet house. The television turned off in the living room. A few minutes later, Carla walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. She paused when she saw Wade still sitting at the dining table. "You're coming to bed?" she asked. "In a bit," Wade said. She studied him for a moment. "You've been going through a lot of paperwork lately." "Business stuff," Wade replied calmly. Carla nodded slowly, though something about her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Good night, then." "Good night." She disappeared down the hallway. A few minutes later, Wade heard the bedroom door close. Just as he reached for the laptop again, his phone buzzed on the table. "Dennis." Wade answered immediately. "You find something?" he asked. Dennis didn't waste time. "Yeah," his brother said. "And you're going to want to hear this." Wade leaned back in the chair. "What is it?" Dennis exhaled slowly. "I did a little digging into Grant Hollister's company. And, well, remember those hotel reservations under Curtis Payne's name? Yeah." Dennis's voice lowered slightly. "I tracked down the expense reports connected to those trips." Wade frowned. "Expense reports?" "Corporate ones," Dennis replied. There was a brief pause. Then Dennis continued. "Looks like Grant Hollister has been using company expense accounts for a lot of those hotel stays." Wade straightened slightly. "You're sure?" "Pretty sure," Dennis said. "Hotels, dinners, travel expenses. All submitted through the company system." Wade's mind began turning quickly. "So the company paid for the trips." "That's what it looks like." Wade stood up and walked slowly toward the kitchen window, staring out at the dark street. "What about Curtis Payne?" he asked. Dennis chuckled quietly. "That's the clever part. Curtis submitted the reports. Grant approved them." Wade remained silent for a moment. "That means," he said slowly, "the company thinks these were business trips." "Exactly." Wade rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "So Grant didn't just hide the affair from me," he said. "He hid it from his company, too." Dennis's tone turned serious again. "Which means this just got a lot bigger." Wade stared out at the quiet neighborhood. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. For days he had been thinking about betrayal, about lies, about the personal damage Carla and Grant had caused. But now another realization settled into place. Something colder, something far more dangerous. What started as betrayal was becoming something much bigger. Corporate fraud. Chapter 5, The Journalist. Dennis suggested bringing the information to someone who could verify it professionally. The idea came up late one evening while Wade and Dennis sat at a quiet diner just off the highway. It was the kind of place truck drivers favored: vinyl booths, stainless steel coffee pots, and a waitress who called everyone hon. Rain tapped steadily against the large front windows as the brothers sat across from each other in a corner booth. A stack of documents lay between them. Bank statements, hotel reservations, expense reports Dennis had quietly obtained through old contacts. The waitress set down 2 fresh cups of coffee. "Anything else for you boys?" she asked. Dennis smiled politely. "We're good, thanks." She walked away, leaving the 2 brothers alone again. Dennis tapped the papers lightly with his finger. "You realize what this is, right?" he said. Wade stirred sugar slowly into his coffee. "Looks like a guy cheating on his wife while stealing from his company." Dennis shook his head. "It's more than that." Wade looked up. Dennis leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just personal drama anymore. This is corporate fraud." Wade didn't respond immediately. The word fraud hung quietly in the air. Dennis continued. "A company executive charging personal trips to a corporate account? That's serious, especially at the level this guy works." Wade sipped his coffee thoughtfully. So what are you suggesting? Dennis leaned back against the booth. I'm suggesting you don't handle this alone. Wade frowned slightly. What do you mean? Dennis gestured toward the documents again. You got evidence. Real evidence. But it needs verification. Someone with resources. Wade waited. Dennis finally said the word that had clearly been on his mind. A journalist. Wade raised an eyebrow. A journalist? Dennis nodded. Investigative reporters deal with this kind of thing all the time. Corporate misuse, financial scandals. If someone confirms this story publicly, it becomes bigger than just you exposing him. Wade considered the idea. He wasn't the type of man who liked attention. His entire career had been built quietly behind the scenes, running crews and managing contracts without drawing headlines. But this situation had already crossed into territory he hadn't expected. Grant Hollister hadn't just disrespected him personally. He had stolen from his own company while doing it. Dennis pulled out his phone and typed something. There's someone you should talk to, he said. He turned the screen toward Wade. The article headline read, Local Executive Resigns After Expense Account Investigation. The byline beneath it read, Bridget Harper. Dennis tapped the screen. She writes for the city paper. Investigative Desk. She's exposed 2 financial scandals in the last 3 years. Wade read the article briefly. It detailed how a financial officer had been caught misusing company funds through falsified expense reports. The writing was direct, detailed, professional. Wade looked back up. You think she'd listen to me? Dennis shrugged. Only one way to find out. The next morning, Wade sat in his office, staring at his phone. The number Dennis had given him rested on a small sticky note beside the keyboard. For a man who had negotiated million-dollar service contracts without hesitation, making this call felt oddly unfamiliar. Finally, he picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang 3 times. Then a woman's voice answered. Harper. The voice was sharp and efficient, the tone of someone used to working under tight deadlines. Ms. Harper? Wade said. Yes. My name is Wade Reeves. I was given your number by someone who suggested you might be interested in a financial misconduct story. There was a pause. What kind of misconduct? She asked. Corporate expense fraud. Another pause. You're going to have to be more specific than that, Mr. Reeves. Wade took a breath. A senior executive using company funds to cover personal travel and hotel stays. The line stayed quiet for a moment. Then Bridget Harper spoke again. Do you have proof? Yes. Documents? Yes. Email them. Wade hesitated slightly. I'd rather show them in person. Another pause followed. Finally, she said, fine. My office. 2 o'clock. Then the line went dead. The newsroom of the city newspaper buzzed with quiet activity when Wade arrived that afternoon. Reporters sat at desks, surrounded by stacks of papers and glowing computer screens. Phones rang occasionally while editors moved between cubicles discussing deadlines. A woman in her late 30s stood near a glass-walled office, speaking to another reporter. Dennis had shown Wade a photo earlier. He recognized her immediately. Bridget Harper. She was taller than Wade expected, with sharp eyes and a focused expression that suggested she missed very little. When she noticed Wade approaching, she ended her conversation and turned toward him. You Reeves? She asked. Yes. She gestured toward the office behind her. Let's talk. Inside the office, she closed the door and sat behind a cluttered desk. All right, she said. Start explaining. Wade placed a folder on the desk. Grant Hollister, he began. Bridget's eyebrows lifted slightly. The Hollister Group executive? The same one. Wade opened the folder and slid the documents toward her. Bridget leaned forward, flipping through the pages. At first, her expression remained neutral. Then she reached the expense reports. Her eyes narrowed. Where did you get these? They're real, Wade said calmly. Bridget didn't look up. She continued reading. Credit card records. Hotel reservations. Dates matching corporate expense submissions. After several minutes, she leaned back slowly. Well, she said quietly, this is interesting. She tapped one of the papers. These hotel charges are listed as business travel. They weren't, Wade replied. Bridget studied him. And you know that how? Wade met her gaze. Because my wife was on those trips. That caught her attention. Bridget leaned forward again. Your wife? Yes. She considered that for a moment. meaning the executive was having an affair during these business trips. Correct. Bridget picked up another page. And this name, Curtis Payne? He works for Hollister. She nodded slowly. So Payne files the expense report. Hollister approves it. Exactly. Bridget closed the folder and folded her hands. You understand something, Mr. Reeves. What's that? If I pursue this story, I'll need to confirm everything independently. I expected that. I'll verify the hotel records, the expense accounts, the corporate filings. Wade nodded. That's fine. Bridget studied him carefully. You're not asking me to bury someone out of personal revenge, are you? Wade's voice remained calm. I'm asking you to verify the truth. For a long moment, she simply looked at him. Then she gave a small nod. All right. She reopened the folder. I'll start digging. Over the next several days, Bridget Harper worked quietly. She contacted hotel managers, cross-referenced corporate filings, examined financial reports tied to Hollister's company. By the fourth day, she called Wade. I finished reviewing the expense records, she said, and her voice carried a tone of quiet satisfaction. Your numbers were low. Wade frowned slightly. What do you mean? The misuse isn't 9,000. Wade sat up straighter. Bridget continued. It's over $22,000. Wade remained silent. Bridget added one more detail. Curtis Payne submitted the expense reports, and Grant Hollister approved them. Within days, Bridget confirmed everything. A story like this didn't stay quiet for long. Chapter 6, The Exposure. The article appeared early on a Monday morning. Wade didn't see it right away. His day had started like most others, before sunrise, with a quick cup of coffee and a quiet walk through the kitchen while the rest of the house remained asleep. Outside, the sky was still a dull gray as the morning crept in. Wade stood by the sink sipping coffee, checking his phone for overnight messages from his work supervisors. A few job updates. One employee calling in sick. A supply order confirmation. Nothing unusual. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door for work. The office parking lot was already half full when he arrived. Cleaning crews were preparing vans for early morning contracts, loading equipment, and checking supply lists before heading to job sites across the city. Wade stepped in his office and placed his coffee cup on the desk. He had just opened his laptop when his phone buzzed. Dennis. Wade answered immediately. You see it yet? Dennis asked. See what? There was a pause on the other end. The article. Wade leaned back in his chair. Not yet. Dennis chuckled quietly. Well, you're about to. Wade opened a browser and typed the local newspaper's website into the search bar. The home page loaded. Right at the top. Front page. A bold headline stretched across the screen. Corporate executive under investigation for misuse of company funds. Below the headline was a photograph. Grant Hollister. The image looked like it had been taken at a corporate conference, Grant in a suit, smiling confidently at the camera. Wade clicked the article. 1 week later, the article was published. It detailed how senior corporate executive Grant Hollister had misused company funds for personal trips and hotel stays connected to an extramarital relationship. The writing was sharp and precise, exactly the way Wade expected from Bridget Harper. The article laid out the timeline clearly. Expense reports submitted under the name Curtis Payne. Hotel stays across multiple cities. Restaurant charges and travel expenses disguised as business meetings. The story included supporting financial evidence. Bridget had included excerpts from expense reports and hotel confirmations. While some sensitive details were redacted, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Each trip lined up with corporate reimbursements approved by Grant himself. Wade scrolled slowly through the article. Near the middle of the piece, Bridget wrote, Internal company records show that more than $22,000 in corporate funds were used for travel and lodging that appear unrelated to any documented business activities. At the bottom of the page, another line stood out. Company representatives declined to comment, but confirmed that an internal investigation has been opened. Wade closed the laptop and leaned back. It had begun. The reaction was immediate. By noon, the article had been shared across several business news websites and social media platforms. Comments and speculation spread quickly. Inside Grant Hollister's company, things moved even faster. Dennis called again later that afternoon. Got an update, he said. Already. Wade asked. Oh yeah, when companies see headlines like that, they move quick. What happened? Dennis cleared his throat. Board of directors held an emergency meeting this morning. Wade remained silent, listening carefully. They launched an internal investigation right away. That was expected, Wade said. Dennis laughed softly. You're not going to believe how fast this moved. What do you mean? Grant's already been pulled from his office. Wade frowned slightly. Suspended? Nope. Dennis paused. Removed. Wade leaned forward slightly. Removed? Board didn't want the risk, Dennis explained. Executive tied to financial misconduct? They cut him loose before the investigation even finishes. Wade let that sink in. Grant Hollister, the confident man who had stood in Wade's living room with a smug smile, was suddenly out of a job. And it had taken less than a week. Dennis continued. Curtis Payne's situation isn't looking much better either. What about him? Well, Dennis said, turns out submitting falsified expense reports isn't exactly good for job security. Wade could imagine. Dennis added, he's been suspended pending review. And after that, Dennis chuckled again. I'd start updating my resume if I were him. 2 days later, Dennis called back with a final update. Curtis Payne was suspended and later terminated for falsifying expense documentation. Grant's professional reputation collapsed almost overnight. For a man who built his career in corporate leadership, that kind of scandal carried long-lasting damage. Executives who misused company funds rarely found positions at the same level again. The business world remembered those stories. Wade continued running his own company, as usual. He didn't talk about the article with employees. He didn't celebrate it. In fact, he barely acknowledged it at all. To Wade, it wasn't a victory. It was simply the outcome of choices other people had made. 3 evenings later, Wade returned home after work to find Carla standing in the kitchen. Her arms were folded tightly across her chest. The television was off. The house felt tense. Wade closed the front door behind him and placed his keys on the counter. Carla didn't waste time. You did this. Wade looked at her calmly. Did what? She grabbed a tablet from the counter and turned it toward him. The same article from a newspaper filled the screen. Bridget Harper's byline appeared at the top. Carla's voice rose slightly. This story. Grant's name everywhere. The investigation. His job. Wade studied the screen briefly. Then he looked back at Carla. And her eyes flashed with anger. Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about. Wade set his jacket down slowly. You think I called the newspaper? I know you did. The silence stretched between them. Carla's voice lowered. Grant lost everything because of this. Wade met her gaze. He lost his job because he stole from his company. You exposed him. No, Wade said evenly. His actions exposed him. Carla shook her head in frustration. You had no right to drag his career through the mud like that. Wade tilted his head slightly. No right. Carla stepped closer. This could ruin his life. Wade didn't raise his voice. He simply answered calmly. Then he should have thought about that before committing fraud. Carla stared at him, searching his face. You planned this, she said quietly. Wade didn't deny it. He simply told her the truth. Actions had consequences. Chapter 7, The Divorce Battle. The tension inside the house lasted less than 2 weeks after the article was published. At first, Carla tried to maintain the same routine. She moved around the kitchen in the mornings, watched television in the evenings, and occasionally attempted small conversations about ordinary things. But the atmosphere had changed. Wade remained calm, distant, and focused on work. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse her of anything. He simply treated the situation like a business problem waiting to be resolved. And Carla could feel it. One evening, Wade returned home to find an envelope sitting neatly on the kitchen counter. It had his name written across the front in clean black ink. He knew immediately what it was. Wade set his keys down and opened the envelope slowly. Inside were several sheets of formal paperwork. Petition for divorce. Wade read through the documents without any visible reaction. Across the room, Carla stood leaning against the doorway with her arms folded. I assumed you'd see this coming, she said. Wade finished reading the first page and set the papers down. I did. Carla studied his expression carefully, as if waiting for anger or frustration. Instead, Wade simply asked, Who's the attorney? Carla stepped forward and tapped the name printed near the bottom of the page. Monica Sloan. Wade recognized the name immediately. Monica Sloan wasn't just any divorce attorney. She was well known across the city for handling high-value divorce cases. Business owners, executives, wealthy couples, people with complicated financial situations often hired her. She was expensive and aggressive. Carla watched him closely. "She's the best," Carla said. "You should probably get a lawyer, too." Wade nodded calmly. "I plan to." Carla seemed almost disappointed that he didn't react more emotionally. "Well," she said, shrugging slightly, "at least we can handle this like adults." Wade folded the papers and slid them back into the envelope. "That depends on the demands." Carla hesitated for a moment. Then she said, "You'll see them soon enough." 2 days later, Wade sat across from his own attorney in a quiet downtown law office. The name on the door read Paul Garrett. Garrett was in his early 60s, with gray hair, wireframe glasses, and the patient expression of someone who had spent decades dealing with legal conflicts. His office shelves were lined with thick law books and framed certificates. Garrett leaned back in his chair as he finished reading the divorce petition. "Well," he said slowly, "your wife didn't waste time." Wade sat calmly in the chair across from him. "What do you think?" Garrett removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I think Monica Sloan enjoys making dramatic opening moves." He flipped to the page listing Carla's demands. Her demands were aggressive. Garrett read them aloud. "Half of Wade Reeves Cleaning Services Incorporated." He looked up. "That's your company?" "Yes." Garrett continued reading. "Spousal support based on lifestyle maintenance." Then he turned another page. "Partial ownership claim of the marital residence." Garrett set the papers down. "Half of Wade's company. Spousal support. Partial ownership of the house." Garrett looked at Wade carefully. "Before I respond to any of this," he said, "I need to understand the financial structure of your assets." Wade opened a folder he had brought with him. Inside were property records, business incorporation documents, and financial statements. Garrett examined them one by one. Several minutes passed in silence. Finally, Garrett leaned back in his chair again. "Well," he said, "this is actually much simpler than Sloan is making it sound." Wade raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Garrett tapped the property deed. "The house is entirely in your name." "That's correct." Garrett nodded. "And the purchase occurred before the marriage." "Yes." Garrett slid the document aside. "That eliminates her claim to ownership." Wade felt a quiet sense of confirmation. Garrett then picked up the business records. "When did you start the company?" 8 years before we married." Garrett nodded again. "That makes the business a premarital asset." He tapped the incorporation date printed at the top. "In most cases, that means she cannot claim half ownership." Wade leaned back slightly. "So her demands don't hold up?" Garrett gave a small smile. "Not very well." But he wasn't finished yet. Garrett reached into Wade's folder again and pulled out a set of bank statements. "These transactions," he said. Wade recognized them immediately. "Charges related to Carla's trips, hotel stays, restaurants, travel." Garrett flipped through several pages. "Your brother helped gather this?" "Yes." Garrett nodded approvingly. "This shows roughly $9,000 spent from the joint account." Wade remained silent. Garrett looked up, and based on the dates, these expenses appear to coincide with her affair. "That's correct." Garrett leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "And that," he said calmly, "changes the negotiation dynamic." The first formal meeting between the two legal teams took place the following week. Wade sat beside Paul Garrett in a conference room with a large wooden table. Across from them sat Carla and Monica Sloan. Monica Sloan looked exactly the way Wade expected. Sharp business suit, perfect posture, eyes that scanned every detail in the room. She began the meeting with professional confidence. "My client believes a fair division of marital assets should include ownership participation in Mr. Reeves' business." Garrett didn't respond immediately. Instead, he slid a folder across the table. "Property deed," he said calmly. Sloan opened it. Her eyes scanned the document quickly. Garrett continued. "House purchased prior to marriage. Sole ownership under Mr. Reeves." Sloan closed the folder slowly. Garrett slid another document across. "Incorporation records. Business established 8 years before the marriage." Sloane read the page. Her expression remained controlled, but Wade noticed her posture shift slightly. Garrett wasn't finished. He placed a third set of documents on the table. Joint account statements. Sloane examined them carefully. Restaurant charges. Hotel charges. Travel expenses. Garrett spoke quietly. These expenditures appear to support an extramarital relationship. Carla's face flushed slightly. Sloane looked up. Garrett finished calmly, which weakens any claim for financial entitlement. For the first time since the meeting began, Monica Sloane leaned back in her chair. She studied the documents again. Then she looked at Carla. A quiet realization passed between them. Monica Sloane quickly realized her client's case was weak. Negotiations shifted dramatically. Chapter 8, The Settlement. The weeks after the divorce negotiations began stretched slowly, each day a careful balance of documents, calls, and strategic meetings. Wade moved through them like he moved through his cleaning contracts, calm, methodical, and precise. There were no outbursts, no hasty decisions, no grand displays of anger. Every step was deliberate. Carla, on the other hand, became increasingly restless. Her sharp suits, perfectly pressed and immaculately styled hair, now seemed like armor she wore to maintain control. Her evenings were spent with Monica Sloane at her side, poring over documents and drafting letters, each page more aggressive than the last. One morning, Wade arrived at his lawyer Paul Garrett's office to find Garrett already reviewing the latest counterproposal from Sloane. "Looks like we've got one more round," Garrett said, tapping the table with a pen. "She's pushing for spousal support, some sort of stake in the business, and, of course, part of the house." Wade nodded slowly. "And our response?" Garrett leaned back, steepling his fingers. "We provide the same documentation as before. The house in your name, the business premarital, and the evidence showing she spent joint funds supporting her own choices. Legally, she doesn't have a leg to stand on for the assets she's demanding." Wade picked up the folder of bank statements. "Let's make it simple for her this time. Clear, concise, undeniable." Garrett smiled faintly. "Exactly the approach I planned." Negotiations continued for nearly a month, each side carefully maneuvering, attempting to gauge the other's limits. Emails flew back and forth. Legal briefs were drafted and redrafted, and phone calls grew more tense. Wade kept his focus on the facts, not the feelings. Carla's tone gradually shifted from defiant to cautious. She realized the foundation of her claims was weak. The house, the business, the very money she thought might secure leverage, all firmly under Wade's control and backed by solid documentation. One afternoon, a conference call was scheduled to finalize terms. Wade sat at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, Paul Garrett beside him, documents neatly stacked. On the other end, Monica Sloane spoke in clipped, controlled tones, with Carla audible in the background. Given the legal documentation provided, Sloane said, "My client will accept the following terms." Wade listened carefully, staying silent as she continued. 2 years of spousal support. Wade's eyes flicked to Garrett, who nodded slightly. "No claim to the business," Sloane added. "And no claim to the house," she finished. Wade exhaled slowly, quietly, as if releasing the weight of the past months. "Understood," Garrett replied. "We will draft the settlement agreement immediately." The paperwork was completed within a few days. Wade signed the final documents in a sunlit office overlooking the city. The divorce was finalized cleanly, without a courtroom trial, without drama, without spectacle. It felt almost anticlimactic after the storm of events leading up to it. Carla moved out shortly afterward. She found a small apartment across town, modest and efficient, everything meticulously arranged. Wade didn't follow up. He didn't question. The separation was complete. The house, which had once been filled with tension and secrecy, finally felt quiet again. The clatter of dishes, the low hum of the television, and the occasional sound of laughter from the living room. Everything had returned to normalcy in its absence. Wade spent the first evening in that quiet home alone, sitting at the dining table with a cup of coffee. He stared out the window at the darkening sky, the streetlights flickering on one by one. For the first time in months, he felt the calm he had been seeking. He thought about all the small victories along the way, the facts, the documents, the verification of truth. Every decision had been deliberate. Every step had been measured. And in the end, the outcome reflected that careful strategy. Yet even as he sipped his coffee, Wade knew there was one thing he could not yet resolve. One conversation he had been postponing. Across town, his 16-year-old son, Cody, sat on his bed, headphones in, headphones out, flipping through a notebook filled with sketches. Wade could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had protected his business, his house, and even his own dignity, but the relationship with his son required honesty and care. Cody had been quiet for months, observing, noticing things that Wade hadn't expected. He was perceptive, more aware than most 16-year-olds. And Wade had known that eventually he would have to confront the truth about everything that had happened. The thought made Wade pause. He wasn't angry with Cody. He wasn't ashamed. He simply knew that the conversation had to be approached with clarity, honesty, and restraint. Wade finished his coffee and set the cup down carefully on the table. He looked around the quiet house, letting the stillness sink in. The divorce was complete. Carla had moved out. The business and the house were secure. But there remained the one discussion Wade had been avoiding, the conversation with his son. Chapter 9, The Talk with Cody. The evening was quiet. The house finally settled after weeks of tension and legal maneuvering. Wade poured himself a cup of coffee and carried it into the living room, where Cody was sitting cross-legged on the couch, headphones dangling around his neck. The soft glow from the table lamp highlighted the contours of his face, showing the maturity that had seemed to arrive all at once over the past year. Wade took a deep breath, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. He sat down beside Cody, careful not to make the moment feel heavy. He didn't want to startle him with anger or frustration, only honesty. "Hey, bud," Wade began, his voice steady but gentle. "Can we talk for a bit?" Cody looked up from his notebook, the sketches inside it forgotten for the moment. He studied his father's face, sensing the gravity in his tone. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. "Yeah, Dad," Cody said finally, voice calm but cautious. "I guess we should." Wade nodded slowly. "I want to talk about some things that happened over the past few months. About me, about your mom, and about us." Cody tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, in a quiet, almost matter-of-fact voice, he spoke. "I already know." Wade blinked, caught off guard. You know?" Cody shrugged, looking away for a moment. "I saw him, Dad. Grant's car. Weeks ago, while you were at work. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I had a feeling something was going on." Wade exhaled slowly, leaning back into the couch. For a moment, he simply let his son's words sink in. The tension in his chest eased slightly, replaced by a strange mixture of relief and admiration. Cody had seen, he had understood, and he hadn't acted impulsively or irresponsibly. "You didn't tell me right away," Wade said softly. "I didn't know how," Cody admitted. "I didn't want to make things worse. And I wasn't sure what was real and what I was imagining." Wade reached over and placed a hand on Cody's shoulder. "I get that, and I appreciate you being careful. I needed to know the truth too, but sometimes it's hard to hear it." Cody nodded slowly. "I was scared, Dad. For you. For us." Wade shifted closer, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know, buddy. That's why I've been taking things one step at a time. I wanted to make sure everything was handled responsibly, that nothing spiraled out of control." Cody studied his father's face. "So, everything that happened with Mom and Grant, it's all over now?" Wade nodded. "Yes. The legal stuff is finished. The company, the house, all of that's secure. But I wanted to talk to you because I needed you to understand what really happened, from me, not from anyone else." Cody leaned back slightly, his arms folded loosely across his chest. "I guess I always had a sense it was bad, but I didn't know how bad. And I didn't know if it would change us." Wade reached out and ruffled Cody's hair gently. "It doesn't, buddy. Nothing about this changes the family we built together. Nothing changes my respect for you. And nothing changes the fact that I'm proud of the young man you're becoming." Cody smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and gratitude. "I was worried, Dad. I didn't want you to be hurt too much. But I see now you've handled it really well." I had to, Wade said quietly. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about protecting what matters and protecting you too. Cody nodded, absorbing his father's words. So, you're not angry at me for not telling you? Wade shook his head with a small smile. Not all. You were doing what you thought was best. And honestly, I think waiting until the right moment shows maturity. You handled that better than most adults would. Cody leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I hate that Mom lied. And that Grant, well, that he thought he could come into our house like that. Wade's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. I know, and that's exactly why I had to make sure everything was addressed properly. You can't let people disrespect your home, your family, or your life. But anger doesn't solve problems. It's strategy and truth that do. Cody nodded slowly. I understand. And I get why you did what you did with the article and everything. Wade leaned back and gave a small, wry smile. Sometimes the truth has consequences. That's just how life works. Cody studied him for a long moment, then said quietly, I'm glad you're my dad. Even with everything that happened, I still know our family matters. And I know we'll be okay. Wade felt a surge of warmth in his chest. He placed his arm around Cody's shoulders. We will be, buddy. I promise you that. And nothing about what happened changes my love for you, or the life we've built together. Cody smiled a little more fully this time. Thanks, Dad. I needed to hear that. I mean, everything's confusing sometimes, but you make it feel right. Wade chuckled softly, ruffling Cody's hair again. Well, that's my job, making things feel right, even when they're not perfect. For a few minutes, they sat in quiet comfort. Cody leaned against his father, feeling the reassurance he hadn't known he needed. Wade's calm presence, his steady voice, and the unspoken understanding that his father had handled everything with integrity created a sense of safety that had been missing for months. Finally, Cody looked up with a faint smile. You know, it's weird. I was mad at Mom at first and scared. But after everything, I just want us to move forward. I don't want this to define us. Wade nodded slowly. It won't. We move forward together. We rebuild stronger than before. Cody's shoulders relaxed, and he leaned back on the couch. I trust you, Dad, and I know you'll always do right by us. Wade's chest felt lighter than it had in months. The conversation he had been avoiding, the one he feared might cause tension or awkwardness, turned out to be a bridge rather than a barrier. It strengthened the bond between father and son, reaffirming the trust and stability that defined their relationship. Wade smiled softly. Thanks, buddy. That means more than you know. Cody grinned faintly. Just don't worry about me. I've got your back, too. Wade ruffled his son's hair one last time before standing. And I've got yours. Always. For the first time since the upheaval began, Wade felt a sense of calm settle over him. The home, once filled with uncertainty, now carried a quiet reassurance. He knew that no matter what had happened, no matter the mistakes others made, the bond he had with Cody would remain unbroken. And for Wade, that bond was the anchor, the proof that some things, no matter how chaotic life became, were unshakable. The conversation ended there, leaving both father and son with a quiet understanding, a sense of mutual respect, and the reassurance that the family they had built together still mattered. Cody's gaze held a clarity and calm that reassured Wade even further. Nothing about the situation changed his respect for Wade. Chapter 10, What Remains. The spring months settled over the city with a quiet, golden light. Trees along the streets stretched their new leaves into the warm breeze, and the smell of fresh-cut grass drifted faintly through the air. Wade Reeves sat on the porch of his house, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sunlight glint off the rooftops of the quiet neighborhood. The world felt calm again, a stark contrast to the storm of the past year. He leaned back in his chair and let the rhythm of life wash over him. The yard was neat, every bush trimmed, the flower beds carefully tended. It had taken him years to cultivate this sense of order, and now, after the chaos of betrayal and scandal, it felt almost sacred. Inside, the phone rang occasionally with business calls, but nothing urgent could disrupt the calm of this evening. Wade's company had grown steadily, and recently they had expanded into a fourth service district. Vans lined up early in the morning, crews coordinating routes with precision. Employees greeted him warmly, often taking moments to thank him for the way he had handled the previous year's turmoil. His calm, deliberate approach had earned their respect and loyalty in ways words never could. Wade's thoughts drifted for a moment to Grant Hollister. Once the arrogant man who had casually smirked in Wade's living room, Grant had resurfaced in a small managerial position at a mid-level company, far below his previous role. The fall had been steep and public. Wade didn't gloat, but the justice of it was undeniable. It wasn't revenge, it was a natural consequence of choices made. Curtis Payne, the subordinate who had facilitated the fraudulent expense reports, had disappeared entirely from the corporate world. A name once tied to deceit and opportunism now carried no weight. Wade had learned enough about consequences this past year to understand that some people faded quietly when accountability reached them. His thoughts shifted to Carla. She had moved into a modest apartment across town, a small, quiet space she had decorated with careful attention to detail. Wade knew she had rebuilt her life in her own way. He didn't involve himself in her choices. He no longer needed to. Their interactions were polite, civil, and distant, limited mostly to matters concerning Cody. That was enough. Speaking of Cody, Wade's eyes scanned the porch railing where his 16-year-old son often leaned, sketchbook in hand, a pencil tucked behind his ear. Cody was focused on his own projects now, school and art and sports. The last conversation they had shared about the family's upheaval had bonded them in ways Wade hadn't anticipated. That bond was steady, unbreakable, and it gave Wade a quiet satisfaction unlike any success at work. He lifted the coffee cup and took a slow sip, savoring both the warmth and the silence. There was clarity in this moment, a clarity born of trials endured and lessons learned. It had been months since the exposure, months since the divorce was finalized. And yet, Wade realized that life had not only returned to normal, it had grown stronger. His business thrived, his home was secure, and his family, small though it now was steady and intact. He thought back to the moment Grant had smirked in his living room, that casual arrogance that had made Wade's blood boil. Back then, it had seemed like the world had tilted on its axis. But today, in the quiet of the porch and the gentle hush of evening, it all felt manageable. What had once felt like chaos was now just a reference point, a lesson in integrity and foresight. Wade's mind wandered briefly to the employees in his office. They trusted him not because he wielded power, but because he had acted with patience and strategy. No temper tantrums, no emotional outbursts, just facts, documentation, and calm authority. That kind of respect, Wade knew, was rare, and it had carried him through the darkest months of his personal life. A soft breeze carried the faint scent of blooming flowers, and Wade noticed the sun sinking lower on the horizon. The colors of the sky shifted, deep orange, soft pink, and gentle purple melting together above the rooftops. He felt the weight of months of tension lifting with each passing moment. The house remained his. The company remained his. The life he had built painstakingly and patiently had not been taken from him. And in that realization, Wade understood something profound. He had not acted out of anger. He had not acted out of revenge. Every step he had taken, from documenting the affair, gathering evidence, contacting Bridget Harper, to navigating the legal and corporate fallout, had been deliberate. Every choice had been made to protect what he built and to hold those accountable for their actions. He remembered the night he sat with Cody, the honest conversation about the affair, the corporate fraud, and the divorce. The clarity in his son's eyes, the unspoken reassurance that their bond remained unbroken, had reminded him why he had acted with calm strategy rather than rage. That moment had reaffirmed his priorities, his integrity, his responsibilities, and the people who truly mattered. Wade glanced down the street. Children played quietly on lawns, neighbors tended their gardens, and a few cars passed by slowly. The world moved forward. It didn't stop for mistakes or scandals, and it didn't pause for pain. Life simply continued, and Wade had ensured he remained firmly on course. He felt a sense of satisfaction, not the fleeting pleasure of revenge, but the deeper fulfillment of clarity and accountability. Those who had acted selfishly and deceitfully had faced consequences. Those who had remained true, patient, and careful, like him, remained standing stronger than ever. A cool breeze ruffled his hair as Wade leaned back, folding his hands over his chest. The porch creaked slightly under his weight, a comforting, familiar sound. The sunset had deepened into dusk, the sky a canvas of twilight shades. Wade inhaled slowly, letting the evening calm him completely. Cody's footsteps approached quietly from inside the house. The boy stopped at the doorway, watching his father for a moment before speaking. "Beautiful evening, huh, Dad?" Cody said. Wade smiled faintly. "It is. Almost makes all the stress from the past months feel like a distant memory." Cody stepped onto the porch and leaned on the railing beside his father. "I like this house. I like that it's ours. I'm glad everything's okay now." Wade looked at his son, feeling the weight of years of responsibility and the relief of having preserved what truly mattered. "It is ours, buddy, and we've worked hard to keep it that way. Remember that life isn't about punishing people. It's about protecting what's right and holding people accountable." Cody nodded, absorbing the quiet wisdom in his father's words. "I get it, Dad, and I'm proud of how you handled everything." Wade smiled softly, his eyes tracing the horizon one last time before he leaned back in his chair. The sun had disappeared completely, leaving behind a sky of soft navy and scattered stars. The world was still moving, still full of challenges, but Wade knew he had built a life resilient enough to withstand them. His house, his company, his son, they were all still intact. And for the first time in months, Wade felt complete clarity. He hadn't acted in anger, nor had he sought revenge. He had simply acted with intention, integrity, and strategy. And in the quiet of that evening, watching the sky darken over the neighborhood he had fought to protect, Wade Reeves realized something simple and undeniable. Everything that mattered, the life he had built, the people he loved, and the values he lived by, remained intact. And that was enough.